The sun was a hammer in the sky, beating down on the cracked red earth of the Arizona territory. Every living thing seemed to have shrunk away from its glare, seeking the scant shade of a mesquite tree or the cool underside of a rock. Mara Collins felt the heat through her worn cotton shirt, a persistent weight on her shoulders. The air was so dry it seemed to steal the moisture from her throat with every breath. It was the summer of 1878, and the land was dying of thirst. Her horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dusty, plodded along, his head low. The rhythm of his hooves was a dull, soft thud in the thick dust. Even the leather of her saddle creaked with a dry, complaining sound. They were following the shallow, winding ditch that her father, Seamus Collins, had dug years ago. A hopeful channel meant to carry water from Coyote Spring to their ranch. Now, it was just a scar of darker dirt, empty and gaping. The Collins Ranch, like every other soul in the valley, human or animal, was withering. Coyote Spring was the only lifeblood left, a trickle of hope in a landscape of despair. It was a place shared, uneasily, between the settlers and the Apache who had called these lands home for generations. As she rounded a cluster of sun-bleached boulders, she saw it. The spring was nestled in a small canyon, a patch of impossible green surrounded by a sea of ochre and rust, and standing beside the pool of water, a man. He was Apache, his back to her. He was tall and lean, his body still in a way that spoke of immense patience. He held a smoldering bundle of sage, its pale gray smoke curling upward into the brilliant blue sky, a fragile prayer offered to the vast, unforgiving heavens. Mara reined Dusty to a halt, her hand resting on the saddle horn. She had seen him before, from a distance. The settlers called him Nakai. He was a warrior, a guide, a silent presence at the edge of their world. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, dipping the sage into the water and raising it again, murmuring words she could not hear, words that belonged to the land itself. There was a reverence in the act, a quiet dignity that stilled the air around him. This was not the savage of the stories whispered in town. This was a man speaking to his God, pleading for the same mercy she prayed for every night. Rain. As if feeling her gaze, he turned. His eyes met hers across the shimmering heat. They were dark, deep-set, and held a surprising stillness. There was no hostility in them, but a clear, unwavering assessment. Mara felt a jolt, a current of recognition that had nothing to do with fear. It was the acknowledgement of one weary soul to another, both bound to this same thirsty earth. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of her head, a gesture of respect for his ritual, for his place here. He did not smile, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease, and he returned the nod before turning back to the water. Mara gathered her reins, meaning to turn Dusty back toward the ranch, her heart a little lighter for the shared moment of peace. But the peace was shattered by the sudden thunder of hooves and the harsh shouts of men. A posse of local volunteers, maybe half a dozen of them, burst over the ridge, their faces flushed with sun and self-importance. Deputy Tom Riker was at their head, his pistol already drawn. "There he is, the dirty thief! He has got the Collins girl," Riker yelled, his voice a raw tearing of the silence. The sudden noise was too much for Dusty, already on edge from the heat and thirst. He reared violently, his eyes wide with panic. Mara, caught off guard, lost her grip on the reins. She felt herself sliding from the saddle as the horse scrambled for purchase on the loose, crumbling rock of the canyon slope. A cry escaped her lips as the ground gave way beneath her. She was falling, tumbling down the steep incline toward a deep, shadowy ravine. The world was a blur of dust and sky. She heard the shouts of the men above, distant and useless. Then, a strong hand gripped her arm, arresting her fall with a force that sent a shock through her body. It was Nakai. He had moved with the impossible speed of a striking hawk. He braced his feet against the scree, his body a solid anchor against the pull of gravity. and hauled her back from the edge. He did not speak, simply held her steady until she found her footing on a narrow ledge of rock, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The posse scrambled down the slope, their boots dislodging a cascade of pebbles. Riker reached them first, his pistol still aimed, his face a mask of suspicion. "Let her go," he snarled at Nakai. Mara found her voice, pushing herself away from Nakai's supporting arm, though her legs still trembled. "Put that away, Tom, you are a fool. He just saved my life." Riker's eyes darted from her face to Nakai's impassive one. The other men looked on, their initial aggression turning to clumsy confusion. Nakai had not moved. He simply stood, watching them, his silence more powerful than any of their shouted words. He had saved the life of the woman they had accused him of harming. The irony hung heavy in the dry air, as thick as the dust they had raised. From the very first moment of true contact, the man her people called an enemy had been her rescuer. The next morning, the fragile truce of shared thirst was broken for good. A man named Whitcomb, representing the Silver and Rail Company, rode into the valley in a smart buggy that seemed entirely out of place. He was dressed in a city suit, and he carried a roll of papers and an air of unassailable authority. Without speaking to anyone, he and 2 hired men drove a freshly cut pine stake into the ground not 10 feet from Coyote Spring. Nailed to it was a metal plate, its embossed letters gleaming in the sun, announcing the company's claim to the spring and all its water, by authority of a temporary territorial permit. The stake was an alien thing, a sharp piece of manufactured geometry driven into the heart of the ancient, sacred land. Word of the claim stake spread through the valley faster than a brush fire. That evening, Seamus Collins sat at his kitchen table, his face etched with lines of worry that had not been there a week ago. Mara watched him, her own heart a tight knot of apprehension. He was a good man, but a man worn down by years of fighting this unforgiving land. The drought was pushing him to a desperate place. "The company promises a pipeline, Mara," he said, not looking at her. "A steady supply, right to our own troughs. No more begging the sky for rain, no more sharing with them." Mara knew who "them" was. "Father, that spring is not ours to take. It belongs to everyone, to the Apache as well. They were here first. They do not have a deed," Seamus countered, his voice rough with frustration. "This is law. This is progress. We cannot let our cattle die because of sentiment." He was echoing the words Mara had heard in town, the words spoken at the meeting he had attended with the other ranchers and the miners from the new silver prospect up the canyon. They saw the company as their salvation, a powerful ally against the drought and the Apache, who they now viewed not as neighbors, but as impediments. Deputy Tom Riker was fanning the flames. He saw the conflict as an opportunity, a chance to assert his own brand of brutal order. He spoke of the Apache as pests, spreading rumors that they would foul the water rather than see it taken. He gathered the restless, angry young men around him, filling their heads with fear and their hands with purpose. Mara felt a profound sense of despair. She wanted to protect her family, her home, but her vision of that protection was one of peace, of finding a way to share the precious gift of water. She saw the quiet dignity in Nakai's prayer, the shared humanity in his eyes. To deny him and his people water was a sin against God and nature, a cruelty she could not abide. Her purpose became clear in that moment. She had to prevent the bloodshed that felt as inevitable as the sunrise. She had to be a voice for reason in a valley going mad with thirst. In his own camp, a quiet collection of wickiups hidden among the cottonwoods, Nakai showed the tribal elder, Chi, a drawing he had made in the dirt with a stick. It was a picture of the metal stake. Chi, his face a roadmap of long years and deep wisdom, listened as Nakai spoke in their tongue, his voice low and steady. He described the men who had come, the piece of paper they held, the arrogance in their eyes. Nakai's goal was not war. War would be the end of them. His duty was to protect their sacred ground, to ensure the elders and the children had water to drink. He was a warrior, but he knew this battle would not be won with arrows or rifles. It would be a battle of wills, a struggle for the very soul of the land. That night, Mara stood on her porch, looking out at the landscape bathed in the pale light of 1,000 stars. The world was vast and beautiful, yet it felt so small, shrinking around a single pool of water. The metal claim stake, though she could not see it, was a splinter in her mind. It was a symbol of a thirst more terrible than the one that parched the land, a greed that saw a holy place and valued it only for what could be piped away and sold. A quiet, undeclared war had begun, and she was standing right in the middle of it. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her despite the warm night air, that prejudice was a fire, and in a land this dry, it would not take much for the whole world to burn. The days that followed the placement of the company's stake were heavy with a watchful silence. The air, already thick with dust, now carried an unspoken tension that settled over the valley like a shroud. People in town spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously toward any Apache who came to trade. The claim stake stood by the spring, an arrogant declaration that poisoned the shared hope the water had once represented. Mara found herself unable to rest. The image of Nakai's quiet prayer was as vivid in her mind as the memory of his hand gripping her arm, saving her from the fall. He was not the enemy her father and Tom Riker described. He was a man who prayed for water and rescued his accusers. An act of such profound decency deserved an answer. One morning, before the sun had begun its assault on the land, she was in the kitchen. She moved with quiet purpose, mixing cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt. The smell of baking cornbread soon filled the small house, a scent of home and sustenance. When the loaves were golden brown, she wrapped one in a clean cotton cloth from their dwindling stores. She took a small leather pouch and filled it with precious salt. It was not much, but it was a gesture, a message in a language older than words. She rode Dusty out toward Coyote Spring, her heart a nervous drum against her ribs. She felt like a trespasser now, in a place that had always felt like a sanctuary. The metal plate on the stake seemed to wink at her malevolently in the early light, choosing a large, flat rock, a respectful distance from the water's edge. The same stone that had shaded a family of quail just yesterday. She laid down her offering, the cornbread still slightly warm, and the pouch of salt. She lingered for only a moment, scanning the silent canyon walls. She felt a prickling on her skin, the certain sensation of being watched, but she saw no one. She turned Dusty and rode away, leaving her silent gift behind. 2 days later, she returned. The anxiety that had churned in her stomach had sharpened to a keen edge of hope and fear. As she approached the spring, she saw that the rock was bare. The cloth, the bread, the salt, all were gone. For a moment, her heart sank. Perhaps an animal had taken it, but then she saw it. Lying precisely where she had left her gift was a knife. She dismounted and approached it slowly. It was not a weapon meant for fighting. The blade was short and sturdy, honed to a sharp edge for skinning or carving. The handle was made of bone, polished smooth by long use, and carved into its surface with delicate, certain lines was a symbol. It was a flowing, serpentine line, a picture of moving water. She picked it up. The handle felt warm and balanced in her hand. It was an answer, as clear and eloquent as any speech. He had understood. Sustenance for sustenance, a tool for living, not for taking life. A shared understanding of what was truly valuable. To understand more, she rode into the small, dusty settlement that passed for a town. Her destination was Luce's Mercantile, a low-slung adobe building that smelled of coffee, leather, and dried chilies. Mrs. Luce, a woman whose face was a beautiful map of sun and time, stood behind the counter. She had been in this territory longer than almost any of the white settlers, and she moved between their world and that of the Apache with a quiet, respected ease. Mara placed the knife on the worn wooden counter. Luz's dark eyes examined it, then lifted to meet Mara's. A slow, knowing smile touched her lips. "This is a good gift," Luz said, her voice warm and raspy like dry leaves. "It says he sees you. He sees you are not like the others." "What does this carving mean?" Mara asked, tracing the wavy line with her fingertip. "It is water," Luz explained. "The water that flows, that gives life. It is his way of saying thank you, and a promise. Maybe that he understands life needs to flow for everyone." Mara felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Can you teach me their word for water?" Luz nodded. "Tu," she said, "the sound short and deep. And for thank you, you would say ahehi." Mara repeated the words, her tongue clumsy and unfamiliar with the sounds. Luz corrected her gently. A patient teacher. It was in that moment, as Mara stumbled over the Apache words, that Tom Riker pushed through the door. The jingle of his spurs was an aggressive sound in the quiet store. "Well, Mara," he said, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Spending your time learning savage talk now?" He leaned against the counter, his proximity an invasion of her space. His gaze fell to the knife. "Where did you get that? One of your redskin friends give you a present?" "That is none of your business." "Tom," Mara said, her voice steady and cold. She picked up the knife and tucked it safely into her pocket. Riker's face darkened. "It is my business to know who is consorting with the enemy. My men and I are keeping this valley safe. Your father understands that, even if you do not." He smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "A pretty girl like you should be more careful who she keeps company with." Mara met his gaze without flinching. "I am perfectly capable of choosing my own company. Thank you." She turned her back on him, giving Luz a grateful nod before walking out into the blinding sunlight, Riker's angry stare burning into her back. The conflict at home was quieter, but cut just as deep. That evening, she found her father at the table, a large sheet of paper spread before him. He had drawn a crude map of their land, the creek, the pastures, with a piece of charcoal. He was tracing a bold black line from Coyote Spring directly to their main stock tank, the proposed route of the Silver and Rail Company pipeline. "They will have the pumps running in a month," Seamus said, his voice filled with a desperate kind of excitement. "We will have all the water we need. Mara, no more watching the sky, no more watching the herd waste away." "And what about the Apache?" Mara asked softly. "What about everyone else downstream?" Seamus slammed the charcoal down on the table. "I have to think about us, about this ranch. Do you remember when we lost the sheep? The blight that took nearly all of them, or the year the corn crop burned up in the fields before it was even knee-high? I will not lose this ranch. Mara, not again. This is our chance, our only chance." His pain was real, a raw wound from years of struggle. Mara understood his fear, but she could not accept his solution. To save themselves by condemning others felt like a different kind of death. The gulf between them felt as wide and dry as the parched land outside. A few days later, Nakai also visited Luz's store. He came to trade several fine rabbit pelts for flour and coffee. He moved through the town with a quiet watchfulness, ignoring the hostile stares and muttered comments. At the counter, Luz spoke to him in a mix of Spanish and his own tongue. She gestured toward the direction of the Collins ranch. "The girl with the hair like a sunset," she said. "She asks for your words." She learned. Nakai simply nodded, his face giving nothing away. But inside, he felt a strange stirring. This girl was different. She had not screamed or run when he had saved her. She had looked at him with clear eyes. She had brought a gift of food, a sign of peace. He was a warrior, and his first duty was to his people, to be wary of the settlers who had taken so much. Yet, his admiration for this one white woman grew, a small, persistent green shoot in the dry ground of his mistrust. Luz taught him the English words, water, thank you, peace. He stored them away, curiosities he might one day use, The wind was a constant presence in the valley, a restless spirit that swept dust from one place to another, blurring all distinctions. One afternoon, a company man rode out to the spring and, with a stick of white chalk, drew a thick line in the dirt a few yards from the water. It was a crude, arbitrary boundary, meant to separate the settlers from the Apache, a silent, childish declaration of ownership. The next day, Mara saw that the wind had already begun its work. The white line was softened, its edges blurred and indistinct. By the following morning, it was gone completely, erased by the indifferent breath of the desert. The law of men was a fragile thing, easily wiped away. Only the law of the land, the need for water, remained. That afternoon, she went to the spring again, the carved knife a familiar weight in her pocket. She saw him there, on the far side of the pool, checking a snare. He did not hide. He stood and watched her approach. The air between them was still, but it was a different kind of stillness now, not of tension, but of anticipation. Gathering her courage, Mara spoke the word Luce had taught her. "Two," she said, the sound coming out flatter than she intended. A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, crossed Nakai's face. He shook his head slightly, a gesture so small she almost missed it. He touched his chest, then pointed to the water. "Two," he said, his voice a low rumble. He drew the sound out, giving it a depth and resonance that made the water itself seem to listen. She tried again, mimicking his tone. "Two." A faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. It transformed his stoic face, revealing a warmth she had not expected. He then pointed to the water again and spoke in English, his pronunciation careful, each sound given its proper weight. "Water." "Water," she repeated, a smile breaking on her own face. It was just one word, exchanged across a contested pool of water under a merciless sun. But it felt like a bridge. It was the beginning of a new language, one not found in books or on legal papers. It was a language built on the simple, shared foundation of respect, a quiet promise that even in a world consumed by thirst, they might still find a way to understand each other. The change came not with a cloud, but with a color. The endless bleached blue of the sky began to bleed at the western horizon, a sickly yellow-brown stain that spread slowly, relentlessly. The air grew still, losing its dry, searing heat and taking on a heavy, oppressive quality, as if the sky were lowering itself onto the land. The birds fell silent. Even the ceaseless drone of the insects seemed to fade into a watchful quiet. Mara felt the change in her bones. A lifetime in this territory had taught her to read the sky, and this was a sky she did not trust. It was the color of dust, of fury. Yet, a restless energy propelled her. The injustice of the company stake gnawed at her, and the strained silence with her father was a constant ache. She felt she had to do something practical. An idea had taken root in her mind if she could measure the flow of the spring, create her own map of its output. She might have a real argument, not one of sentiment, but of fact, something her father, a practical man, might be forced to acknowledge. She gathered a few wooden stakes, a ball of twine, and a small hammer, stuffing them into a canvas saddlebag. She did not tell Seamus where she was going. He would have forbidden it, his fear for her safety eclipsing his reason. She saddled Dusty, his ears twitching nervously, his eyes rolling at the strange, colored sky. "It is all right, boy," she murmured, stroking his neck, her own words a flimsy shield against her growing unease. As she rode toward the spring, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind, which had been a constant companion for weeks, died completely. The silence was so profound she could hear the creak of her saddle leather and the soft thump of Dusty's hooves, as if they were the only sounds in the universe. She reached the narrow opening of the canyon that sheltered Coyote Spring and dismounted, tying Dusty's reins to a sturdy greasewood bush. She was working near the pool, driving a stake into the damp earth. When the first gust of wind hit, it was not a breeze, but a physical blow. A solid wall of air that stole her breath and tore at her clothes. It was followed almost immediately by the dust. The world vanished, the sky, the canyon walls. The very ground beneath her feet were erased in a churning, blinding cloud of red-brown grit. It was like being plunged underwater in a sea of earth. The sun was gone, replaced by a suffocating twilight. The wind howled, a rising, shrieking chorus that seemed to tear at the very rocks. Mara stumbled back, covering her mouth and nose with her sleeve. Her eyes squeezed shut against the stinging particles. She groped her way toward the canyon wall, seeking any kind of shelter. She found a shallow overhang, a small scoop in the rock, and pressed herself into it, making herself as small as possible. The roar was deafening, a constant, grinding assault on her senses. She could feel the vibration through the stone at her back. Then came a new sound, a sharp, percussive ticking against the rock above her head. It was not rain, but something harder. Small pebbles, ripped from the canyon rim by the wind. And then, the rain began. It was not a gentle shower. It was a deluge, a sudden, violent unleashing. The drops were huge and cold, striking the parched earth with the force of thrown stones. The dust cloud turned to a thick, running mud that streaked down her face and plastered her hair to her scalp. The sound of the wind was soon joined by a deeper, more terrifying roar. It came from up the canyon, a low, guttural rumble that grew louder with every second. A flash flood, the bone-dry ground, baked hard as brick by the sun, could not absorb the sudden torrent. The water was running off the high desert, funneling into the narrow canyon, gathering speed and power. Mara peered out from her inadequate shelter. A churning, muddy wave, filled with uprooted sagebrush, branches, and debris, was surging down the wash. It filled the narrow space from wall to wall, a furious, unstoppable force. Her heart leaped into her throat. Dusty, she had left him tied, but the way back was already a raging river. She was trapped. The water was rising fast, lapping at the edge of her rocky ledge. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the chaos, just as a scream of pure terror was building in her chest. A figure materialized out of the rain and gloom. It was Nakai. He seemed not to be fighting the storm, but to be a part of it, moving with a sure-footed grace that defied the treacherous ground. He did not shout. He did not need to. His eyes found hers, and in their calm depths, she saw a command. He pointed higher up the canyon wall, to a place that looked sheer and impossible. He reached her in 2 long strides, his hand closing around her arm. His grip was firm, not harsh, a silent anchor in the storm. He led her along the rising ledge, the roaring water now licking at their heels. They reached a spot that seemed to be a dead end, a solid wall of rock, but Nakai reached out and pulled aside a thick, dripping curtain of ancient vines, revealing a dark, narrow opening she would never have seen. He pushed her gently inside, then followed, letting the vines fall back into place. The sound of the storm was instantly muted, the roaring chaos outside reduced to a distant, muffled thunder. They were in a small, dry cave, a hollow in the heart of the rock. The air was cool and still, smelling of stone and dry earth. A profound, sheltering silence enveloped them. For a moment, they both stood, breathing heavily, the water from their soaked clothes pooling around their feet. Then, a violent shiver racked Mara's body, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in her bones. The adrenaline was fading, and the cold was setting in. Nakai moved to the back of the small chamber. In a shallow pit, a handful of embers glowed faintly. He knelt, blowing on them with a steady, gentle breath, adding small, dry twigs from a hidden recess. In moments, a tiny flame flickered to life, casting a warm, dancing light on the smooth stone walls. The gentle Apache drew her into his silent lodge. He retrieved a thick, woven blanket, its patterns telling a story in dark wool and pale yucca fiber. He unfolded it and draped it over her trembling shoulders. She huddled into its warmth, but she could not stop shaking. The cold was too deep. Nakai watched her for a moment, his face unreadable in the flickering light. Then he sat down on the floor beside her, his back against the rock wall. He reached out and gently pulled her against him, wrapping a part of the blanket around them both. His body was a source of steady, radiating heat. She resisted for a half-second, her mind still catching up to the reality of their situation. And then she sagged against him, her exhaustion and cold overwhelming her. She could feel the solid strength of his shoulder and chest, the calm, even rhythm of his breathing. The shivering slowly subsided, replaced by a profound sense of safety that seemed to seep into her very soul. He held her without tension, his presence a simple, undeniable fact of survival. His body kept her warm until dawn. He did not speak, but after a time, he reached into a leather pouch and pulled out a strip of dried meat. He offered it to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The meat was tough and smoky, but it was the most welcome food she had ever tasted. From another pouch, he produced a handful of dried leaves and dropped them into a small clay cup with some water from a skin. He set the cup near the fire, and soon the air was filled with the fragrant steam of herbal tea. He passed it to her, and she held the warm cup in both hands, letting the heat soak into her frozen fingers before sipping the clean, slightly bitter brew. Outside, the storm raged on, its fury a distant rumor. Inside the small, warm space, a fragile peace took hold. The long silence was not awkward. It was a space for them to simply be, two human beings sheltered from the violence of the world. To break the intensity of the moment, Mara found herself speaking, her voice a little rough. "I tried to make more cornbread," she said, looking into the fire. "The first one I brought you, it was a good one. This time, not so good." He turned his head slightly, his attention fully on her. "I was thinking," she continued, a small, self-deprecating smile touching her lips, "about my father and the claim stake. And what to say, I forgot the bread was in the oven. When I finally remembered, it was black, like a piece of charcoal, hard as a rock." She picked up a small stone from the cave floor. "A rock," she said, holding it out, "like this." She saw a flicker in his dark eyes. A low sound rumbled in his chest, a sound she had never heard from him. It was a chuckle, deep and genuine. It grew into a quiet laugh, a sound of pure, unforced amusement that crinkled the corners of his eyes and filled the small cave with a startling warmth. The sound was so unexpected, so welcome, that Mara felt an answering laugh bubble up inside her. For that one moment, they were not a settler's daughter and an Apache warrior. They were just a man and a woman, sharing a story about burned bread while a storm raged outside. As the night wore on, the storm slowly spent its fury. The howling of the wind quieted to a mournful sigh, and the drumming of the rain softened to a steady, dripping rhythm. They remained as they were, huddled together under the blanket. Mara felt the last of the tension leave her body. She was safe, here, in this hidden place with this silent man. She felt safer than she had in weeks. She was aware of the scent of sage and wood smoke that clung to him, the strength in the arm that rested lightly around her shoulders. She recognized the feeling that was blooming in her chest, a feeling that was more than gratitude, more than respect. It was a deep, resonant connection, a quiet and certain knowing. Nakai was intensely aware of the woman pressed against his side. He could feel the fine tremor that still occasionally ran through her, the softness of her hair where it brushed against his cheek. It would be easy to misinterpret this moment, to let the fragile trust she had given him be reshaped by desire. But his discipline was as much a part of him as his own bones. His duty was to protect, and he fulfilled it without question. Yet, he allowed himself this one thing, the simple, profound warmth of her trust, a gift more precious than any he had ever received. When the first pale light of dawn filtered through the vines, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed. A profound quiet had settled over the land, broken only by the sound of dripping water. They emerged from the cave into a world transformed. The air was cool and clean, smelling of wet earth and creosote. The canyon floor had been scoured, its contours changed. The sun rose into a sky of impossible clarity, its light catching the thousands of tiny water droplets that clung to every rock and plant, making the entire canyon glitter as if it were strewn with diamonds. The dust of anger and suspicion had been washed away, and, for a little while, the world felt new. They walked back in silence, but it was a silence full of things unsaid, a shared promise born in the heart of the storm. The clean, quiet world that the storm had revealed did not last. The peace was as fleeting as the pools of water that quickly vanished from the baked earth, sinking away or stolen by the thirsty sun. Within a week, the dust was back, and with it came Mr. Whitcomb. He arrived not in a dusty buggy, but in a freshly washed one, pulled by a pair of handsome gray horses that looked as out of place as he did. He carried a leather portfolio and wore an expression of supreme satisfaction. He did not go to the spring this time. He went directly to the saloon, where he found Deputy Tom Riker holding court among a group of miners and idle ranch hands. Whitcomb unrolled a new document on the bar. It was thicker than the last, adorned with an impressive-looking seal and tied with a blue ribbon. "The exclusive water rights," Whitcomb announced, his voice smooth and confident. "Fully authorized and registered, the Silver and Rail Company is prepared to invest heavily in the future of this valley. That means jobs, security, and progress." He slid a small, heavy purse across the bar to Riker. "And to ensure that progress is not impeded, the company has retained your services, Deputy, to maintain security and order at the site." Riker hefted the purse, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Order," he repeated, the word tasting good in his mouth. "I can provide plenty of that." The new alliance between the company's money and Riker's authority sent a current of aggressive confidence through the town. On Sunday, the feeling even seeped into the small adobe church. Father Donnelly stood before his congregation, a man whose gentle nature seemed at war with the harshness of the land. His sermon was not about greed or theft, but the words he chose were potent. He spoke of God's mandate to be fruitful, to multiply, and to bring order to the wilderness. He praised the spirit of enterprise and the civilizing influence of industry. "We are called upon to be stewards of this land," he preached, his voice echoing in the rafters. "To tame its wildness, to channel its bounty for the good of the community, to build a future of stability and prosperity." Mara sat beside her father on the hard wooden pew, the words settling like stones in her stomach. She saw the nods of agreement from the other ranchers, the satisfied expressions on the faces of the miners. They heard a divine blessing for their plans. They heard that channeling the bounty of Coyote Spring into a single pipeline was not theft, but holy work. When the service ended, Seamus placed a hand on her arm. "You hear that, girl?" he said, his voice earnest. "Even the man of God sees the sense in it. This is the way forward." He saw her silence not as dissent, but as reluctant acceptance. For Mara, it was the silence of a heart that had no words for such a profound misunderstanding of faith. Later that week, Mara was at the town well, drawing a bucket of water. A few Apache children were playing nearby, their laughter a bright, uncomplicated sound. They chased a lizard near the adobe wall of the mercantile, their small hands, muddy from a puddle left by the storm, pressing against the wall for balance. They left a scattered pattern of perfect, miniature handprints in the red-brown mud, a fleeting record of their joy. Mara smiled, watching them. Then, two of Whitcomb's men approached, carrying a bucket of paste and a roll of posters. They brusquely shooed the children away. The children scattered, their laughter silenced, replaced by wary expressions. One of the men slapped a thick layer of paste directly over the muddy handprints, obliterating them. Then he unrolled a poster and smoothed it into place, in large, bold black letters. It proclaimed a single word: progress. Below it, in smaller print, were promises of prosperity from the Silver and Rail Company. Mara stared at the poster, a cold fury rising within her. It was more than just a sign. It was a declaration of erasure, a statement that one future must be pasted over another, that the simple, joyful marks of a child's existence were meaningless in the face of a capitalized word on a piece of paper. That evening, the saloon was crowded. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of stale beer and sweat. Mara had no business there, but as she walked past, she saw her father through the window, talking with a group of other ranchers, driven by a desperate need to make him understand. She pushed through the swinging doors. The sudden silence was almost complete. The laughter and loud talk died as every man in the room turned to stare at the lone woman in their midst. Seamus's face clouded with surprise and anger. "Mara, what are you doing here? This is no place for you." "I came to talk," she said, her voice clear and steady, refusing to be intimidated. She looked past her father to the other men. "I came to ask what gives the Silver and Rail Company the right to kill this valley." An older rancher named Peterson scoffed. "Kill it. They are saving it. That pipeline is our future." "Your future," Mara countered, her gaze sweeping across their faces. "What about the Apache? What about the families downstream who have no stake in your silver mine? What about them?" Tom Riker, who had been watching from the bar, pushed himself forward. "They ought to have thought of that before they chose to live like savages. This is our land now. We have papers to prove it." "A piece of paper does not stop a child from being thirsty," Mara shot back, her voice ringing with passion. "That spring belongs to the earth. It gives its water to everyone, not just those who can afford to lay a pipe. Water flows downhill. There is no law of God or man that says it has to flow past the poor." The room was utterly still for a long moment, the truth of her words hanging in the smoky air, simple and unassailable. Then Riker laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Listen to her," he sneered, looking around at the other men, inviting them to join his ridicule. "She spent one night out in a storm, and now she thinks she understands the Great Spirit?" He took a step closer to her, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "I will tell you what I think. I think she is not worried about the thirst of any child. I think she has been bewitched by a redskin. That warrior Nakai has filled her head with his heathen nonsense." A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. The men's faces, which had for a moment shown a flicker of doubt, now hardened with renewed suspicion and contempt. Riker had not refuted her argument. He had attacked her character, using their deepest prejudices as his weapon. Her reason was dismissed as feminine foolishness, her compassion as a sign of improper loyalties. Seamus grabbed her arm, his face flushed with shame and fury. "That is enough," he growled, pulling her toward the door. "You have made a fool of yourself, and of me." He pushed her out into the dark street and followed, the swinging doors closing on the renewed buzz of conversation inside, now centered on the scandal of the Collins girl and her Apache friend. Humiliation burned in her cheeks. She had tried to speak reason and had been answered with slander. She went not home, but to the one place she knew she would find a measure of sense. The light was still on in Luz's mercantile. Luz was sitting in a rocking chair, mending a saddle blanket. She looked up as Mara entered, her dark eyes taking in the girl's troubled expression. Mara recounted the scene at the saloon, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. Luz listened patiently, her needle moving with a steady, rhythmic stitch. When Mara finished, the older woman set her mending aside. "Men are fools, little bird," she said, her voice a comforting balm. "Especially when they are scared. and they are all very scared. They are scared of the drought, scared of losing what little they have. A scared man will believe any slogan that promises to save him. She nodded toward the street, in the direction of the poster. Progress is a beautiful word, but it is a hungry one. It eats up everything that is not strong enough to get out of its way. Miles away, in the quiet of the Apache camp, Nakai sat with Chi by a small fire. He had been in the hills above the town, a silent observer. He had seen the poster go up. He had seen Mara go into the saloon. He recounted what he had witnessed, his voice low and dispassionate. Chi listened, his ancient eyes closed. He was a man who had seen treaties made and broken, who had seen promises turned to dust. The white man's words are like the wind, he said in his own language. They change direction without warning. They make a lot of noise, but they cannot quench a man's thirst. Their progress is a storm that flattens the corn and frightens the deer. We must be like the deep-rooted tree. Mara, we must bend, but we must not break. The girl with the sunset hair has a strong spirit, but a single tree cannot stop a storm. Nakai knew the elder was right. The conflict had moved beyond a simple claim stake. It had become a war of words, of posters and sermons, a fight for the hearts and minds of the valley. And in a war like that, the truth was often the first casualty. The simmering tension in the valley finally boiled over on a blistering afternoon. One of Seamus's ranch hands found it, a young steer, one of their best, lay dead on the bank of Coyote Spring. It was not a death of thirst or sickness. The animal's body was bloated, its legs stiff, and a sickly foam caked its mouth. The scene was unnatural, a violation of the quiet order of the wilderness. By the time Mara and Seamus arrived, Tom Riker was already there, his horse trampling the delicate ferns at the water's edge. He stood over the carcass with a grim, theatrical satisfaction. "Poison," he declared, his voice carrying across the canyon. He did not need to see evidence. He had his conclusion ready. "It is the Apache. They are poisoning the water. I warned you this would happen. They would rather see us all die than share." Seamus's face went pale, a mixture of fear and fury hardening his features. Mara knelt by the water, her gaze sweeping the area. "There is no proof of that. Tom," she said, her voice low but firm. "It could have been a snake bite, or it could have eaten a poisonous weed." Riker laughed, a short, ugly bark. "A weed. Do you take me for a fool, girl? This is their work, a warning." He looked at Seamus, his eyes glinting. "You have been too soft. Collins, your daughter here, with her sweet talk and her gifts to the savages. She has invited this on us." The accusation struck Seamus like a physical blow. He looked at Mara, his eyes filled with a fresh, terrible doubt. The memory of her defending the Apache in the saloon, combined with this dead animal at his feet, was a potent poison of its own. He turned away from her, his jaw set like granite. "Get some men," he said to Riker. "We will post a guard here, day and night." He would not look at Mara. In his mind, her compassion had become a liability, a weakness that had brought this darkness to their doorstep. The night was moonless and suffocatingly hot. Mara lay in her bed, unable to sleep. The image of the dead steer burned into her mind. The silence of the ranch was heavy, unnatural. Then she smelled it, a faint, acrid scent on the still night air. Smoke, but it was not the familiar smell of a hearth fire. This was the hungry, angry smell of burning hay and dry timber. She threw on her clothes and ran outside. The sight that met her eyes was a vision from a nightmare. The large storehouse, where they kept the winter feed, the harvested grain, and their tools, was engulfed in flames. A monstrous column of orange and yellow fire clawed at the black sky, sending a shower of glowing embers onto the dry grass. The panicked whinnies of the horses in the nearby corral and the terrified lowing of the cattle tore through the night. Seamus was already there, shouting, his face a ghostly mask in the firelight, The ranch hands ran back and forth with useless buckets of water. The fire was too big, too hot. It was consuming everything. "The grain!" a young voice cried out. It was Finn, Mara's 17-year-old cousin who worked on the ranch. He was a good-natured boy, all lanky arms and earnest energy. Before anyone could stop him, he darted toward the side door of the burning structure, trying to get to the sacks of recently harvested wheat. "Finn, no!" Mara screamed. A section of the roof, weakened by the flames, groaned and then collapsed inward with a deafening crash. A wave of superheated air and flaming debris blew out of the doorway. Finn was thrown back. A cry of pain ripped from his throat. He fell to the ground, clutching his leg. Mara ran to him, ignoring the searing heat. A long, splintered piece of burning timber had struck him, tearing through his trousers and gouging a deep, ugly wound in his thigh. The chaos was absolute. Her father was trying to organize a fire line. The other men were battling a losing fight. No one was coming. She and Finn were alone in their small circle of pain. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she helped him limp away from the inferno, back toward the relative safety of the ranch house. She laid him on the kitchen table, his face pale with shock. His teeth gritted against the pain. The light from the single oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. She cut away the scorched fabric of his trousers. The wound was deep, bleeding sluggishly, the edges raw and splintered. They were miles from a doctor. There was no one to help. Mara took a deep breath, pushing down the nausea and fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She washed the wound as best she could with whiskey and clean water. She found her mother's sewing kit, her hands trembling as she threaded the smallest, sharpest needle. "Hold still, Finn," she whispered, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "This is going to hurt." By the wavering yellow light of the lamp, with the roar of the fire and the shouts of men as a terrible chorus, Mara stitched the flesh of her cousin back together. Outside, the fight for the storehouse was lost. The men now focused on preventing the flames from spreading to the other buildings. As they worked, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness at the edge of the firelight. It was Nakai. He had seen the glow from the hills and had come, not as an enemy, but as a man who knew the ways of fire. He moved with a swift, silent efficiency, appearing where he was needed most, beating back the spreading grass fires with a wet burlap sack he had found. His movements economical and effective. He worked at the periphery, a phantom helper in the chaos. Tom Riker saw him. He had just ridden up with 2 men, drawn by the blaze. He saw a fleeting glimpse of the Apache warrior, illuminated for a second by a burst of flame. Prejudice and suspicion blinded him to any other possibility. "There they are," he roared, pulling his pistol. "The fire starters." He fired a shot into the darkness where he had seen Nakai. Nakai felt a searing line of pain across his shoulder as the bullet grazed him. He did not cry out. He simply melted back into the shadows. His work of mercy repaid with a gunshot. He vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving only a few trampled embers and a growing stain of blood on his deerskin shirt. The fire finally burned itself out as dawn approached, leaving a smoldering, blackened skeleton where the storehouse had stood. The rising sun revealed a scene of utter devastation, exhausted and smoke-stained. Seamus Collins stood staring at the ruins, his face a mask of despair. Everything they had worked for, the fruits of a whole season's labor, was gone. "It was them," Riker said, his voice hard and certain. "I saw one of them myself, lurking in the shadows. They did this. First the steer, now this. They mean to drive us out. Collins." Seamus looked at the ruin, then at his daughter, who had just emerged from the house, her face pale and streaked with soot, her hands stained with her cousin's blood. The weight of it all was too much. He nodded slowly, accepting Riker's poison as truth. It was a simpler, easier answer than confronting the complexities of hatred and greed. Later that morning, after she had cleaned and redressed Finn's wound, Mara walked out to the burned-out storehouse. The ground was a soupy mess of ash and mud where the men had thrown water. Something caught her eye. In a patch of soft mud near the back wall, preserved from the main chaos, were footprints. They were not the soft, indistinct prints of moccasins. They were deep, clear impressions of heavy work boots, the kind with thick soles and iron hobnails, the kind of boots the miners wore. She stared at the prints, and the terrible truth of the night's events fell into place. The dead steer, the fire, Riker's immediate accusations. It was a lie. All of it. A carefully constructed lie designed to ignite the very fire that had consumed their livelihood. Whitcomb did not just want the water. He wanted a crisis. A small war to justify seizing the spring and crushing any opposition under the heel of maintaining order. She ran to her father, pulling him to the back of the ruin, pointing at the tracks in the mud. "Look," she pleaded, her voice raw with desperation. "Look at these prints. They are not Apache. They are miners' boots. Do you not see? We have been tricked. Riker, Whitcomb. They started this fire." Seamus stared at the footprints, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. He saw the truth in her words, the undeniable evidence before his eyes. But to accept it meant accepting his own foolishness, his own willingness to believe the worst. It meant standing against the other ranchers, against Riker's authority, against the company's promises of salvation. It meant siding with his daughter against the world, a daughter who consorted with the very people everyone blamed. The conflict tore at him. He looked from the boot prints to the smoldering ruin, then to his daughter's earnest, pleading face. He saw her truth, but he was not yet strong enough to claim it as his own. He turned away without a word, leaving her standing alone beside the damning evidence. A chasm of fear and indecision gaping between them. A few feet away, a patch of limestone was stained dark where Finn had fallen, a permanent mark that no rain could ever wash away. The days after the fire were a purgatory of ash and silence. A foul, smoky haze clung to the ranch, a constant reminder of the violation. Finn was recovering, his wound healing cleanly thanks to Mara's careful stitches. But a deeper wound had been inflicted on the valley's spirit. The lie of the Apache raid had taken root, nurtured by fear and nourished by Riker's constant provocations. Seamus moved through his days like a ghost, his eyes hollowed out by loss and a terrible, unspoken conflict. He would not meet Mara's gaze, and the space between them was filled with the bitter smoke of their burned storehouse. Mara knew that grief and anger would solve nothing. The boot prints in the mud were a cold, hard fact, a truth that she could not let be buried under the ashes. While her father was paralyzed by doubt, she was galvanized by certainty. She had a plan, but she could not enact it alone. She needed allies who saw the world not in terms of property lines and legal papers, but in the fundamental language of survival and justice. She rode to town, her purpose a shield against the suspicious glances that followed her. She went to Luce's mercantile, the one place that felt like neutral ground. Luce was stacking tins of peaches, her movement slow and deliberate. She looked up as Mara entered, and her wise eyes saw everything: the exhaustion, the anger, and the new, hard resolve. "They have pushed too far," Mara said, her voice low. There was no need for preamble. Luce nodded, placing a final tin on the shelf. "When a snake is cornered, it strikes at anything that moves." "I need to speak with him," Mara said. "With Nakai, and with Chi. I have a plan, but it will not work without them. It has to be a plan for everyone, or it is no plan at all." Luce studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow, measured nod. "Some plans are best made in the dark, little bird. Come back after sunset. Use the back door." That night, Mara slipped out of the ranch house and rode under the cover of a sliver of moon. The back room of Luce's store was small and crowded, filled with the smells of burlap, dried herbs, and old paper. A single lantern cast a warm, conspiratorial glow. Nakai was there, his presence filling a corner of the room with a quiet intensity. The graze on his shoulder had been treated, but Mara could see the stiffness in his movements. Beside him sat Chi, the elder, his face a landscape of wrinkles, his eyes holding the long, patient memory of his people. Luce stood by the door, a silent guardian. Mara laid a large, tanned piece of cowhide on the table. In her hand, she held a piece of charcoal from her own ruined storehouse. "They have a map," she began, her voice steady. "A map of paper that shows how to take all the water for one place. I believe we need our own map, a map that shows how to share it." For the next hour, they worked. It was a council unlike any the territory had ever seen. Chi did not need to see the land to know it. He spoke in his soft, raspy tongue, with Luce and Nakai translating, and with a gnarled finger. He traced the memory of the water onto the hide. He showed them the paths the springs had taken when his grandfather was a boy, the secret places where water seeped from the rock after a storm, the deep pools that never went dry. His was the knowledge of generations, a map written in story and song. Nakai added the details of the present. He took the charcoal and drew the precise location of the game trails that led to water, the places where the ground was firm enough to support a temporary channel, the way the flow from the spring split and weakened as it moved downstream. He had watched the water every day of his life. He knew its moods, its strength, its secrets. His was the knowledge of the observer, a map written in silence and patience. Luce added the human element. She pointed to places on the crude map and spoke of the families who lived there. The widow Miller, whose small garden was her only source of food. The Esposito family, with their 6 children and their few thirsty goats. Her knowledge was of the community, a map of need and hardship that transcended race. And Mara, she drew the lines that connected it all. She sketched out a system of simple, temporary dams made of rock and earth, a way to divert the water's flow on a schedule. "The ranches need the water most in the morning, for the cattle," she explained, her charcoal scratching on the hide. "So, in the morning, the channel flows west. At midday, the sun is highest. The village needs the water then. We open this channel, and the water flows east. In the afternoon, the miners come off their shift. They need water for themselves and their mules. We open a 3rd channel, toward the canyon." She looked up at the faces in the lantern light. "It would work," she said, her voice filled with a desperate hope. "There is enough water, if we are smart, if we are fair." Chi studied the map, his head nodding slowly. "The water does not belong to one man," he said softly. "It belongs to the thirst of all living things. This is a good map. It speaks the truth." To prove their theory, they spent the next day in the field, a strange and secret party of surveyors. Chi remained in the shade, directing them, while Luce, Mara, and Nakai walked the land. Nakai taught Mara the language of the rocks, how a particular arrangement of stones could communicate a message across a silent landscape. 3 flat stones, one on top of the other, he explained, his voice a low rumble. "This means the path is safe, the way is clear." He then balanced a long, pointed stone on top of a round one. "This means danger! Turn back!" Later that afternoon, working on her own, Mara tried to mark a clear path down a shallow wash. She carefully placed a round stone and topped it with a pointed one, proud of her work. When Nakai and Luce returned from scouting a ridge, they found her waiting. Nakai stopped, looked at her stone marker, and then looked at her. A faint, almost invisible smile touched his lips. "The path is safe?" he asked. "Yes," she said proudly. "You have told the rocks there is a bear in that wash," he said, his dark eyes crinkling with amusement. Mara's face burned with embarrassment. They had to walk an extra mile, all the way around the wash, their boots sinking in the soft dirt. As they finally reached their starting point, tired and dusty, Mara was still muttering about her foolishness. Nakai stopped her with a light touch on her arm. "Sometimes," he said, his voice soft but clear. "The long way around avoids the traps that lie on the short path." His words were about more than just her misplaced rock. They were a perfect, gentle summary of their entire struggle, and Mara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. But while they were building their fragile hope, Mr. Whitcomb was busy selling a different kind of future. He drove his buggy directly to the Collins ranch. Finding Seamus overseeing the clearing of the debris from the fire, Whitcomb did not bluster or threaten. He was a portrait of sympathetic understanding. "A terrible tragedy, Mr. Collins," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "A terrible loss. The work of desperate men. It proves my point. You see, this valley needs order. It needs security." He opened his leather portfolio and produced a crisp, clean document filled with elegant script. It was a formal contract between the Silver and Rail Company and the Collins Ranch. "We value you as a pillar of this community," Whitcomb continued smoothly. "We want to ensure your prosperity. This contract guarantees it. We will install a state-of-the-art steam pump at the spring, and from that pump, a private, dedicated pipeline will run directly to your property. Your own troughs will never run dry again. No matter what happens to the rest of the valley, you will be secure, independent." Seamus stared at the contract. The words seemed to shimmer in the harsh sunlight. A private pump, his own water, an end to the fear, the uncertainty. It was everything he had ever wanted. It was a simple, powerful solution. A fortress against the chaos that had just consumed his livelihood. "What do you want in return?" Seamus asked, his voice hoarse. "Your support, of course," Whitcomb said with an easy smile. "Your public endorsement of our project, your help in persuading the other ranchers, a small price to pay for a lifetime of security. Would you not agree?" Seamus took the contract in his hands. The paper felt heavy, substantial. He thought of the boot prints his daughter had shown him. He thought of her pale, determined face after she had stitched up her cousin's leg. He knew, in a part of his soul that he tried to keep silent, that she was right. He knew this offer was a bribe, a devil's bargain. But he also saw the black, skeletal timbers of his storehouse. He felt the phantom heat of the flames. The fear was a physical presence, a cold hand gripping his heart. He looked from the promises on the paper to the ruin of his land, and he wavered. The charcoal map of his daughter's hope was a world away, a fragile idea against this solid, tempting promise of salvation. The sun reached its zenith, a merciless white eye hanging directly overhead. It burned away all shadows, leaving the world stark and exposed. In the shimmering heat, secrets had no place to hide, and every soul in the valley was revealed in the harsh, unforgiving light. It was in this blinding glare that Tom Riker chose to make his stand. He had caught a boy. Nato, a quiet Apache youth of maybe 16, had come to the spring with a water skin, an act he had performed 1,000 times in his life. For Riker, this was the perfect opportunity. He declared it theft. Now! Nato was tied to the very claim stake the company had driven into the earth, his hands bound tightly behind him. He stood straight, his young face a mask of defiant pride. But the fear in his eyes was a stark betrayal of his posture. Riker and 2 of his hired men stood guard, their rifles held loosely, their expressions a mixture of boredom and cruel satisfaction. Mara saw the scene from a rise as she rode toward the spring. A cold knot of fury and dread formed in her stomach. This was not about justice. It was a deliberate provocation, a public display of power meant to humiliate and incite. She spurred Dusty forward, her mind racing. This was a line that could not be crossed. She reined her horse to a halt a few yards from the group, the air crackling with a tension that was almost visible in the wavy heat. "Let him go." "Tom," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the unshakable weight of command. Riker turned, a slow, insolent smile spreading across his face. "Well, look who it is. Come to plead for your little savage friend. He was stealing water. Mara, company water. This is what happens to thieves." "He is a boy getting a drink," Mara countered. Swinging down from her saddle, she stood her ground, placing herself between Riker and his captive. "He has a right to this water. His people were drinking from this spring when your grandfather was still in diapers. You have no authority to do this." "I have all the authority I need," Riker said, tapping the silver star pinned to his vest. "Paid for and proper. Now, you get back on that horse and ride on home before you get yourself into trouble you can't talk your way out of." He took a menacing step toward her. Mara did not flinch. "I am not leaving without him." The standoff was absolute. The sun beat down. Sweat traced clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. The two hired men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between their boss and this lone, defiant woman. From the high rocks of the canyon rim, hidden from view, Nakai watched. His rifle was a cool, heavy weight in his hands. He had followed NATO, a silent guardian, and now he was a witness to this quiet, brutal theater. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to send an arrow into Riker's black heart. But he held himself in check with an iron will. One act of violence from him would be the excuse Riker and Whitcomb needed. It would bring a war down upon his people, a war they would not survive. His duty was to be patient, to be the unseen threat, to wait for the right moment. The choice was a fire in his gut: unleash the warrior and doom his people, or remain a ghost and watch this injustice unfold. Riker, frustrated by Mara's refusal to be intimidated, lost his patience. He shoved her roughly aside. "I'm done talking," he snarled. He drew his pistol and walked toward NATO, grabbing the boy's hair and forcing his head back. Maybe a lesson is in order. Time seemed to slow. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. The world narrowed to the glint of the sun on Riker's pistol, the fear in NATO's eyes. This was it, the moment where everything broke. Crack! The sound was not the flat bark of Riker's pistol. It was the sharp, powerful report of a rifle, echoing from the high canyon walls. It was so sudden, so unexpected, that every man froze, simultaneously. The new metal sign Whitcomb had posted, the one that read, "No trespassing, property of Silver and Rail Co., leaped from its post. A chunk of wood and metal splintered into the air as a bullet punched a neat, dark hole directly through the word trespassing. Silence. A profound, ringing silence descended, broken only by the faint, surprised chirping of a wren. Everyone's head snapped toward the high rocks. They saw nothing, but the message was as clear as if it had been carved in stone. "You are being watched. You are in my range. The next shot will not be a warning." Riker slowly lowered his pistol, his face a mixture of fury and a new, unwelcome sliver of fear. He scanned the silent, sun-baked rocks, but the shooter was invisible, a godlike presence who had passed judgment from on high. The balance of power had shifted. It was no longer 3 armed men against a boy and a woman. It was a siege. Into this frozen tableau, 2 new figures appeared, walking slowly from the direction of the town. It was Luce, her face calm and determined. And beside her, red-faced and sweating in his black clerical clothes, was Father Donnelly. Luce had seen Mara ride toward the spring and had known in her bones that trouble was brewing. She had gone straight to the church, her words a quiet but insistent summons to the priest's conscience. "Deputy Riker," Father Donnelly called out, his voice a little breathless from the walk. "What is the meaning of this?" He stopped, taking in the scene: the boy tied to the post, Mara's defiant stance, the splintered sign, the palpable tension of a gunfight yet to happen. "This boy is a thief." "Father," Riker said, his bravado returning now that he had a new audience. "I am simply administering a little frontier justice." "There is no justice in tying a boy to a post in this heat," the priest said, his gaze firm. "This is cruelty. Release him at once, in the name of God." As if the scene were not complicated enough, another rider appeared. It was Seamus Collins. He had seen Luce and the priest walking purposefully out of town and had followed. A knot of dread tightening in his stomach, he reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the impossible scene. His daughter, standing against the deputy, the Apache boy, a captive, the shattered sign, and the unspoken threat that hung in the air, a threat that emanated from the silent, watchful rocks. He was caught, literally and figuratively, in the middle. On one side of the spring stood Riker, the symbol of the company, the man who held the key to his ranch's salvation in a contract that now felt like a lead weight in his pocket. On the other side stood his daughter, the embodiment of his conscience. Her courage, a brilliant, painful light shining on his own weakness. He could not move forward. He could not retreat. He simply sat on his horse, a statue of indecision under the brutal, truth-telling sun. The standoff stretched, the silence broken only by the buzzing of flies and the sound of their own ragged breathing. They were all trapped in a moment of perfect, unbearable clarity. Riker could not back down without losing face. Mara would not abandon the boy. Nakai could not reveal himself. Seamus could not choose. It was Luce who finally broke the spell. She looked from one grim, sweaty face to another, a flicker of wry humor in her dark eyes. "You gentlemen seem to have forgotten something," she said, her voice dry as the dust under her feet. "You are fighting over water, but you forgot to bring any to drink." The absurdity of it, the simple, profound truth in her words, hung in the air. Here they were, ready to kill each other over a trickle of water, and they were all slowly being baked alive by a sun that was enemy to them all. No one moved. The warning shot still echoed in the silence, and the choice between courage and cowardice, between justice and profit, was laid bare for all to see. The uneasy truce of the previous afternoon had curdled overnight into a brittle, watchful hostility. The dawn broke not with hope, but with the cold, gray light of a final reckoning. News of the standoff had spread through the valley on the wings of fear and rumor. By the time the sun had cleared the eastern mesas, a crowd had gathered at Coyote Spring. They were two separate crowds, a mirror image of the valley's deep division. On the west bank stood the ranchers, the miners, and the townsfolk, a grim-faced assembly drawn by a mixture of curiosity and a grim sense of ownership. On the east bank, silent and still, stood the Apache. Chi was there, his ancient presence a testament to his people's claim. And beside him, no longer hidden, stood Nakai. The air was as still and heavy as a held breath. Then came the sound of carriage wheels. Mr. Whitcomb arrived, looking clean and confident, his city suit an affront to the dusty landscape. Beside him in the buggy sat a stern-faced man with a drooping mustache and a territorial marshal's badge pinned to his coat. Whitcomb held up his official-looking document as if it were a holy text. "This is the final word," he announced, his voice carrying in the quiet air. "The territorial government recognizes the Silver and Rail Company's exclusive rights to this water source. Marshal, you are here to see that the law is enforced. This land is now private property. I want it cleared." Tom Riker swelled with renewed authority. This was his vindication. He strode to the water's edge, his gaze fixing on Nakai across the narrow stream. "You!" he shouted, pointing a finger. "You are the ringleader. You are the one who shot at us yesterday. You are under arrest for attempted murder." Nakai did not move. He simply met Riker's gaze, his own face a calm, unreadable mask. "I'm talking to you," Riker snarled, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. He drew the weapon, its dark metal a stark and ugly thing in the clean morning light. He leveled it at Nakai's chest. "On your knees." The crowd on the west bank murmured, a low, nervous sound. The Apache on the east bank stood like statues carved from the red rock, their hands empty but their eyes filled with a fire that had slumbered for a generation. Seamus Collins sat on his horse at the back of the crowd, the contract from Whitcomb a toxic presence in his saddlebag. Before anyone could react, before a command could be given or a trigger pulled, Mara moved. She walked with a steady, unhurried pace, down the bank, through the shallow, clear water of the stream, and up the other side. She did not stop until she was standing directly in front of Nakai, her back to him, her body a shield between him and Riker's gun. The water dripped from the hem of her dress, making dark spots in the dust. She raised her chin, her eyes locking with Riker's. "No," she said, her voice shaking only slightly, but filled with a power that silenced the entire valley. "If you shoot him, you shoot me first." Riker stared, his face a mask of disbelief and pure fury. "Get out of the way, Mara. This does not concern you." "It concerns everyone," she said, her voice growing stronger. She turned her head slightly to look at her father, her gaze a direct, desperate plea. "This is a lie, all of it." She turned back to the crowd. "You have been told the Apache poisoned our cattle. You were told they burned our storehouse. You have been told that this piece of paper," she gestured toward Whitcomb, "is the law, but you have not been told the truth." From a leather pouch at her belt, she pulled the tanned cowhide map. She unrolled it for all to see. The dark charcoal lines, a stark contrast to Whitcomb's official script. "This is a map of how to share the water, not how to steal it. This is a plan for survival, not for profit." She then pointed to the ground. "When our storehouse burned, I found tracks in the mud, not moccasins, the heavy, hobnailed boots of miners." A nervous stir went through the group of miners standing near the front. One man, a young miner with a perpetually worried face, shifted his weight, his hand going unconsciously to the pocket of his jacket. "You have been fed a diet of fear because it makes you easy to control." Mara continued, her voice ringing with the clarity of her conviction. Whitcomb, seeing the mood of the crowd begin to shift, stepped forward. "These are the hysterical ravings of a woman who has clearly fallen under a corrupting influence. Marshal, do your duty." The nervous young miner, jostled by his neighbor, fumbled in his pocket. A folded, grimy piece of paper fell from his jacket and landed unnoticed in the dust near Luce's feet. Luce, who had been watching everything with an eagle's sharp eye, bent down with a slow, deliberate movement and picked it up. "It seems you are a careless man, Mr. Whitcomb," she said, her voice surprisingly loud. "You write letters, but you do not make sure your employees can be trusted with them." She unfolded the paper. "This one says, and I quote, 'A significant disruption is required to secure the community's full cooperation. A fire would be most persuasive. See that it is done. You will be well compensated.'" A collective gasp went through the crowd. The young miner who had dropped the letter went white as a sheet. Whitcomb's face, for the first time, lost its mask of smug superiority. It collapsed into a panicked snarl. "That is a forgery, a lie." He turned, intending to bolt for his buggy, to escape the web of his own deceit. He ran directly into a solid wall. Seamus Collins had dismounted and now stood in his path, his face a terrible thing to see. It was the face of a man who had finally seen the full, ugly truth of the bargain he had been willing to make. He grabbed Whitcomb by the front of his fine city coat, his big, calloused rancher's hand twisting the fabric. "You," Seamus growled, his voice a low rumble of pure rage. "You did this to us." With his master exposed and his authority shattered, Riker was an animal cornered. He was alone, his lies stripped bare, but he still had a gun. "This is not over," he spat, his pistol still wavering between Mara and Nakai. Nakai spoke for the first time, his voice calm and deep, cutting through the tension. "It is over," he said. He took a step to the side, away from Mara's protection. "But if you must have a final word, let it not be spoken with a woman between us." He looked at the new, official metal plaque that Riker had hammered to the claim stake. "You believe in that sign. I believe in the water. Let us see which is stronger." He proposed a contest, a duel not of men, but of symbols. A single shot. The one who could shoot the chain that held the metal plaque to the stake would have his answer. Riker, his pride stung, his world collapsing, saw it as his only way out, a last desperate gamble to reclaim his authority through violence. "Fine," he hissed. "You first." Nakai shook his head. "The choice was yours," he said, indicating that Riker should take the first shot. Riker raised his pistol, his arm trembling slightly with rage. He fired. The shot was loud, a flat, angry sound. The bullet struck the wooden stake, sending a spray of splinters into the air, but the chain held firm. Now it was Nakai's turn. He had not moved from his spot. He did not seem to aim so much as to become one with the rifle in his hands. He fired. The report was sharp, clean, and final. High on the stake, the top link of the small iron chain shattered. For a half-second, the metal plaque hung crookedly, and then it fell. It hit the water with a soft splash, sinking immediately, its arrogant proclamation swallowed by the cool, clear spring. The sun glinted on the ripples that spread outward from where it had vanished. A profound silence fell. It was broken only by the gentle, eternal sound of the water flowing over the place where the sign had been. In that moment, Seamus Collins finally made his choice. He had raised his own rifle when the standoff began. A man torn between two worlds. Now, he lowered it, the barrel pointing at the harmless dirt. He looked at his daughter, standing proud and alive on the far side of the stream. "I choose a living daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion, but loud enough for all to hear. "Over dead land." The spell was broken. The tension washed away like the plaque in the stream, leaving behind only the stark, simple truth. The battle for Coyote Spring was over. The aftermath of the confrontation at the spring was not loud or violent, but a quiet, seismic shifting of the foundations of the valley. The territorial marshal, a man who dealt in facts rather than opinions, efficiently took Mr. Whitcomb into custody. The signed letter, combined with the terrified confession of the young miner who had dropped it, was evidence that could not be ignored. Whitcomb's fine carriage rolled away under guard, a symbol of a false progress being escorted out of town. Tom Riker did not wait to be dismissed. In the face of Seamus's cold fury and the stony silence of the very men he had incited, his authority evaporated. He packed his saddlebags before noon and rode out of the valley without a word, a man consumed by his own poisons. In the days that followed, a fragile and unfamiliar quiet settled over the land. It was not the silence of fear, but of contemplation. The brush with open warfare had left everyone shaken, humbled by how close they had come to destroying each other. The focus shifted from the grand, empty promises of a company to the practical, immediate reality of their shared thirst. A new council was formed, not in the back room of a store, but in the open air, beside the spring that had almost been their undoing. Seamus Collins was there, his face etched with a new humility. Father Donnelly came, his faith now tempered with the hard-won knowledge that order without justice is a hollow creed. Luce was a quiet, indispensable presence, her wisdom a bridge between the two sides, and representing the Apache were Chi and Nakai. Mara brought out the cowhide map again. This time, it was not a secret proposal, but a starting point for a real agreement. They talked for hours, their voices reasonable and low. They debated the needs of cattle versus the needs of gardens, the timing of the miners' shifts versus the sacred hours of the Apache's day. There were arguments, but they were the arguments of neighbors, not enemies. By the end of the day, they had a treaty. An agreement far stronger than any document tied with a blue ribbon because it was written in the language of mutual respect. The plan Mara had first sketched out was adopted as the law of the spring. Mornings, the water would be channeled to the ranches. At midday, it would flow to the Apache village. In the late afternoon, the channel would be diverted to the miners' camp. They established a small, shared fund for the upkeep of the channels and the reinforcement of the spring's banks, with each community contributing what they could, be it coin, lumber, or labor. It was a practical solution, born not of a grand vision, but of a simple, shared need to survive. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of purple and rose, Seamus found Mara on the porch of the ranch house. He stood beside her for a long time, watching the colors fade, the silence between them. Once a chasm of unspoken anger, was now a quiet space of healing. "I was a fool," he said finally, his voice thick. He did not look at her, but at the darkening land he had almost lost. A blind fool. That contract, Whitcomb's promises, I was so scared of losing everything again, like with the sheep. That fear. It was a thirst of its own. It made me blind to the truth that was standing right in front of me. I was so thirsty. Mara. I nearly went blind. Mara reached out and placed her hand on his weathered arm. "We were all thirsty, Father," she said softly. He finally turned to look at her, and she saw in his eyes not the hard-headed rancher, but the father she had always known. His love for her a fierce and now humbled thing. "I am proud of you," he said, the words a release, a confession, an apology all in one. "You are stronger than I ever was." The next morning, Nakai and Chi came to the spring not with weapons, but with tools. They began to place the marker stones that would guide the flow of the water, arranging them in the ancient patterns that Nakai had tried to teach Mara. He worked with a quiet, focused grace, his movements precise and meaningful. He was not just building a dam. He was restoring a harmony that had been broken. Mara brought them a bucket of fresh water from the house and a loaf of cornbread. This time, it was not burned. Chi accepted it with a grateful nod, his old eyes crinkling in a smile. Later, Mara found herself working alongside Nakai, building one of the small wooden sluice gates that would control the flow of the channels. They worked in a comfortable, easy silence for a time. The sounds of their hammer and saw a rhythmic, productive counterpoint to the gentle murmur of the spring. "So," Mara said, breaking the silence as she held a piece of lumber steady for him, "now that we have a treaty for the water, we should probably have one for the chores." Nakai paused, a hammer in his hand, and looked at her. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "A treaty?" "Yes," she said, her own eyes sparkling with mischief. "For instance, I think the one who is better at building things." She patted the sturdy frame of the gate they were constructing. "Should be the one to do all the heavy lifting." "And the one who is better at making cornbread," he countered, his voice a low, gentle tease. "Should be the one who washes the pots." Mara laughed, a clear, happy sound that seemed to belong to this new, peaceful place. "I am not sure I agree to those terms," she said. "I think we need to negotiate. Perhaps the one who has to carry the water should be excused from washing the pots." "That seems fair," he said, his smile deepening. He went back to his work, but the air between them had changed. It was filled with the light, easy grace of a shared joke. The simple, profound joy of two people finding their rhythm together. It was a romance born not of whispered sweet nothings, but of shared labor, of dirt under the fingernails and the common goal of making a small piece of the world a little better. That evening, when Mara returned to the ranch, she found a small, tightly bound bundle of sage hanging beside the front door. She knew who had put it there. It was not just a gift. It was a blessing, a symbol of protection, a quiet promise of peace. The house no longer felt like a fortress against the world. It felt like a home again. The sound of the spring, now flowing freely and fairly, seemed to reach all the way to their porch. A constant, gentle song of hope. The light in the valley was different now. It was not the harsh, glaring light of confrontation, nor the dim, hazy light of fear. It was a soft, clear light, the kind of light that lets you see a long way and lets you see the good in things. It was not a perfect world, but it was a world that was healing. The passing of the seasons brought a slow, deep healing to the valley. The fierce heat of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. And with the cooler weather came a change in the hearts of the people. The shared water from Coyote Spring was a daily sacrament, a reminder of their interdependence. The carefully tended channels, flowing according to the treaty, were a testament to a peace that was not imposed by law, but built by hand. It was on a clear, cool afternoon, with the scent of pine and dry leaves in the air, that Nakai led Mara back to the small cave that had once been their shelter from the storm. The vines that curtained the entrance were now tinged with red and gold. Inside, the air was still and cool. A silent chamber holding the memory of that long, desperate night. They stood for a moment in the quiet dark, the outside world falling away, leaving only the two of them. "This place," Mara said softly, her voice echoing slightly against the stone. "This is where we stopped being enemies." "We were never enemies," Nakai answered, his voice a low rumble. "We were just two people on opposite sides of a stream, waiting for someone to build a bridge." He took her hand, his calloused palm warm and strong around hers. "I think," he said, his gaze as steady and clear as the spring water, "that it is time to make that bridge permanent." It was not a proposal in the way her people would have understood it. There was no ring, no kneeling. It was a simple statement of fact, a recognition of a truth that had been growing between them since the first moment their eyes had met across the thirsty ground. Mara's heart filled with a quiet, certain joy. "Yes," she whispered, "it is time." Their ceremony was not held in a church or a village, but in that same small cave, a place that belonged only to them. Their guests were the four people who had become the cornerstones of the valley's new peace. Luce came, her dark eyes shining with a deep, maternal pride. Father Donnelly arrived, his black coat dusty from the walk, his face filled with a genuine, humble grace. Chi was there, wrapped in a blanket, his presence lending the weight of generations to the simple proceedings. And Seamus Collins stood beside his daughter, his eyes clear, his hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture of silent, absolute blessing. There was no single rite, but a blending of traditions, an acknowledgement that their union was something new, forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. Chi lit a small bundle of sage, and its clean, sacred smoke filled the cave, a blessing for the spirits of the place. Father Donnelly spoke not of scripture, but of the profound grace in finding a partner to walk with through the wilderness of life. His words simple and heartfelt. Luce, as a witness for them both, simply smiled, her presence a powerful affirmation of their bond. Then, facing each other in the soft light filtering through the vines, Mara and Nakai spoke their vows. They were not promises of blind obedience or endless wealth, but a simple, profound covenant that bound them to each other and to the land they both loved. "I will help you keep the water," Nakai said, his hand holding hers. "I will help you keep the word," Mara answered, her voice clear and strong. And then, together, their voices blending in the quiet of the cave, they made the final promise. "We will keep each other." That simple pledge was their foundation. Upon it, they built a life. They did not settle on the Collins Ranch or in the Apache village, but in a small adobe house they constructed themselves, on a piece of neutral ground not far from the spring. It became a natural crossroads, a meeting place for the valley. Nakai's deep knowledge of the territory, once a thing to be feared, was now recognized as a valuable asset. He became a guide, leading survey parties for the railroad and escorting travelers through the treacherous, beautiful landscape he knew so well. He was a bridge between the old world and the new, his quiet confidence and unerring sense of direction earning him a respect that went far deeper than the color of his skin. Mara, in turn, became a teacher in the shade of a large cottonwood tree near their home. She started a small, informal school. Her students were a motley collection of the valley's children. The lanky, sun-bleached sons of ranchers sat beside the dark-eyed, curious children of the Apache and the grubby, energetic offspring of the miners. She taught them their letters, how to read and write their names. But she also taught them other things. She taught them how to read the sky for signs of rain. She taught them how to use a level and a piece of twine to measure the flow of water, so they would understand for themselves the principles of sharing. She was not just teaching them facts, she was teaching them to be neighbors. The justice they had found in the valley was a quiet, practical thing. It had not come from the barrel of a gun or the pronouncements of a distant government. It had come from the hard, necessary work of seeing each other's needs and choosing to meet them. Their love was like the water treaty, a living, breathing agreement that required daily attention and constant, unwavering commitment. It was a partnership that was not an escape from the world, but a way to stand more firmly within it, each one providing the shade that the other needed to survive the harshness of the sun. One evening, as the last light of day painted the western sky a deep, bruised purple, Mara and Nakai stood together on the small rise overlooking their home. The air was cool, and the sound of the spring was a steady, peaceful song in the quiet. Below them, the light from their window cast a warm, yellow square onto the darkening ground. Near the door, a single wooden post had been driven into the earth. Hanging from it, side by side, were two hats. One was Mara's sturdy, wide-brimmed hat, stained with the dust and sweat of a full day's work. The other was Nakai's, a simple, unadorned leather cap, worn smooth by the wind and the rain. They hung there together in the twilight, a simple, eloquent statement of a life built together, as humble and as enduring as the land itself. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments below to connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.